When we can have an impact on turnover, there are a host of retention strategies that we can engage in. And let's start with some of the things on table 12.4. We've got clarifying promotional paths. A real clear path helps talented people know that there's opportunities ahead of them and that they will know what they need to do, when they need to do it, so that they can be in a line for a promotional opportunity. We want to challenge them. We want to stretch them. We want to push them to do things outside of their comfort zone. Again, get them ready. And when people feel stretched and pushed, it's a very intrinsically rewarding experience for people. That's the autonomy, mastery, and purpose stuff. We want to make sure that people feel like they can reach their goals. We want to make sure we've got better supervision. We want to make sure we have good managers that are building trusting relationships. We want to make sure we are giving employees work flexibility. So, we don't have to say, you must be here between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and you cannot stay later, and you cannot, come in earlier. We want to set up a situation where we allow some flexibility so people can come in at 10 o'clock if that's better for them in their schedule, but they're willing to stay till 6. So when we can give workforce flexibility for people, we are more likely to meet their needs. They're more likely to feel loyal to us for being flexible with them. We want to make sure, we have a good location. And again, sometimes we can't really control where our company is, but if we can locate our company in a good area, where there are fewer competitors, so if we need to pick up our headquarters and move it somewhere else, if we can do that, try to do it in a place where there's few competitors, where you're going to get good high quality people, and less competition, less of an inclination for people to leave for a local competitor. Additional retention strategies include things like competitive wage and benefits. Again, it should be a no-brainer, right? As you saw from the previous video on turnover and why people leave, why high performers leave, it's because they're not getting good wages and benefits. And so we really need to make sure that we are paying fairly, getting that off the table so that we can really inspire people to be more intrinsically motivated by their job. We want to hold managers accountable for retaining the top performers. So retention rates should be a part of a manager's performance improvement plan. If they are losing people, they need to figure out why. And if they're not making efforts to make those changes, then we maybe don't want to keep them as a manager anymore. We want to make sure our employees have all the support they need, particularly new hires, as we talked about the importance of socialization. And the socialization doesn't end in the first week of the new job. It's an ongoing process. We need to be continually socializing. I don't mean having fun, like going out and having drinks and stuff, but I mean socialization in that sense of the word, where we are making sure people are engaged and interwoven into the company culture. We want to make sure that we are creating a mobility barrier. And what we mean by that is putting employees in a way so that their value is more important for them inside our company than it is for them to leave. So we create an environment where we show them how much they are appreciated and that they are in a much better situation staying with us than they are moving elsewhere. Particularly if we are giving them firm-specific knowledge, that's knowledge that they can't use in another firm. So the more that we can encourage them to learn our way of doing things, we create more loyalty and we create a greater barrier for them to want to go elsewhere. We also want to make sure we've got a good, strong culture that is a positive culture, a good, emotionally positive culture, where people can connect with other people, they can authentically be themselves, they can engage in dialogue, they can get along with others, have people to hang out with. They can be honest about, fears of making mistakes. They can make mistakes. They can learn from mistakes. All of these things are an important part of a strong culture. And if you have a really negative culture, people aren't going to want to stay with your company. Retention during mergers and acquisitions is always a challenge. And so our goal, of course, is to try to find a way to keep the high-performing talent in-house. And one of the things that we can do is to have a particular agreement with them. Oftentimes it's called a golden handcuff, where we create a disincentive for them to leave and to go to another company. And so it can be bonuses or stock options. It could be more pay, more of a greater responsibility after the merger. But the goal is that we want to keep our high performers, and we will create a separate incentive package for them to stay as we move through the transition. You can also argue if you're going to be doing layoffs after your merger, you want to be able to say the longer you stay with the company, the greater your severance package, so that you don't lose people in the middle of the transition when you could use their help. And you can say, look, we may not be able to keep you, but I'm going to pay you additional funds if you stay through the transition. So you can write your severance package set up in such a way to keep them through that process. But you want to make sure that it's in writing, for your sake and for the employee's sake, and make sure that everybody's in agreement on what the terms are, when you expect them to leave, what kind of work effort you expect from them, et cetera, et cetera. Mergers and acquisitions are always a challenge, but the more that we can do to create an incentive for people to stay over the long haul and even stay through the transition financially, as a financial incentive, that's our goal. We already spent a lot of time talking about succession plans when we were talking about how to assess internal candidates, or how to even source internal candidates. Having a good succession management plan in place makes that work really easy for us. And so once we get our employees, even as we hire external employees, they now become part of our internal labor market, and we need to make sure we've got a really good succession management plan in place for them. So this has to be tied in with our strategic plan to make sure key strategic positions are managed well, that they've got a good succession plan in place for it. We want to make sure we've got a career plan in place for people who are in that line of succession, so that we are doing good developmental things for every level in the company. A mobility policy is the rules that we set up for when people can move from area to area, department to department, job for job. When are they eligible? What can we expect in terms of compensation and advancement if people are going to be moving internally? We may not pay for moving expenses. We might decide to pay for moving expenses. We may make sure that people have the freedom to apply for any position and any promotional opportunity available, or we may limit them that they can only do that after they've been with the company for 6 months or a year. So there's all sorts of rules that can go into those policies. I think your textbook does a really nice job of going into some of those details. But we need to be clear in our policies who is eligible, when they're eligible, what they can expect in terms of pay and advancement, and the benefit changes as they move through the company, which positions will have different kinds of benefits and why. And so when this is clear and it's communicated in our succession planning and our employee handbooks, this is important to us. Redeployment means that we move employees to other areas of the company, to other jobs in the company that may be a better match for them, or where we need talent, and they may not be. So you might have somebody that worked in one department but is being redeployed to that department in another location because they need somebody to fill that vacancy, and we want to fill it with somebody that we know that we can trust. So redeployment is important as we think about workflows through the company. We think about that transition matrix and lateral transfers that are potentially feasible. We want to make sure we've got redeployment software that helps us match talent to business needs. That's what our human resource information system is about. We want to make sure that we're looking at our employees' expertise and knowledge, so that they are deployed in a location to maximize the use of their talents. And again, this is where our human resource management information system is really important. And again, as it says here, for firms trying to maximize the efficiency of their workforce, which is important if you're a low-cost strategy provider, optimization is critical. So we will see less concern with deployment for differentiation strategy companies. It's important, but not as important as it is for somebody like a Walmart that is pursuing a low-cost strategy, because Getting maximum use of your talent is key when you are competing with a very tight profit margin. One way is that we can manage our employees, particularly if, as we have gone through our forecasting and we look that we are expecting a surplus of employees, and that could be based on economic conditions in the company or market demand. It could be any number of things. But the bottom line is, we may have to downsize and voluntarily separate employees from the company, and that's not necessarily based on their performance individually or their success as hardworking employees. Sometimes it's about the financial standing of the company. So we have to consider downsizing as an option, but I never encourage people to go right to the downsizing option until they start thinking about other strategic initiatives that they could do differently. And sometimes those strategic initiatives are enough to fix your problem. But if they're not, then downsizing has to be done hand in hand with new strategic initiatives. Downsizing usually comes when we have a merger or acquisition, or there's a market share loss or a profit loss, technological or industrial changes, new organization structures, or we've done a really lousy job of forecasting, which can always happen. And the goal is that we reduce the number of our employees, and by definition, by reducing your expenses, lo and behold, as you know from basic math, when you reduce your expenses, your profits will improve. So that doesn't always mean that it's a good thing. Just because we can make the numbers look good based on mathematic principles doesn't mean that it's a strategic change that's actually good for the company. If your company is already losing money because of problems, then a layoff doesn't solve your problems. It just makes you look more profitable. You've got to figure out how to solve your problems as well. So downsizing is a really good option when you need more flexibility, if you've become too bureaucratic, if you find that your decision-making effectiveness has really gone down because there are too many layers of bureaucracy to go through, and because your communication is poor. So that's why downsizing makes sense. If those are solutions to your strategic problem, then downsizing is the right choice for you. Private sector employees downsize to reduce costs and maximize returns, the basic math formula. Remove expenses, profitability improves, and they expect to remain competitive by reducing those expenses. And sometimes that's good, but it also depends on which employees you're going to be losing during your downsizing. Because just because you plan to only lose certain handfuls of employees doesn't mean you're going to actually keep the ones that you really want. Your really talented employees are going to see the writing on the wall, and they're more likely to jump ship and go elsewhere. Public sector downsizing, usually working for government agencies and things like that, are usually because of budget reductions, usually from government revenues, tax bases, and technology improvements that require us to have less employees. And so we might do a layoff in the public sector situation based on introducing new technology. Now, if you have a public sector union, or even if you have a private sector union, your layoff decisions have to be negotiated with your union. So remember that you have to make sure you're in alignment with that. There are a variety of different ways that we can do downsizing. Table 12.5 from the textbook is titled Downsizing, Targeting Methods. And so we can do across-the-board downsizing, where basically every department has to reduce by a certain percent. You could do geographic downsizing, where certain locations are going to be decreased, and it might be because that location is having financial difficulties, or that area is having financial difficulties, or the product or service that they offer out of that location may not have a demand anymore. You could do business-based downsizing, where specific business units will be decreased or cut. You can do position-based downsizing by saying all positions with this title will be let go. And that was a very common downsizing technique during the late 80s and early 90s, when we started getting rid of the middle layers in organizations, where we went from the very tall, thin, hierarchical organizations to shorter, fatter ones by eliminating middle managers at a certain level. So we We eliminated the middleman and shrunk the organization size. So a lot of middle managers lost their jobs during that time. So that's one possibility. You can also do it based on function. Certain functions may be decreased or shrunk because of redesign work that's been going on in the company. Org development is a big part of that, where we look at what's the best and most effective way to structure our organization, and we redesign our organization, and then certain departments may be distributed or they may be shrunk, or because workflows have been managed differently to be more efficient, not just effective, but also efficient. Table 12.5 continues on this page, where we look at performance-based downsizing, where we simply lay off people based on performance. The poorer performers get let go. Now, this is challenging if we don't have a good performance appraisal system, where we don't have a good evaluation process where we can really and truly differentiate between good performers and poor performers. So performance-based downsizing has its limitations, because if we don't have a good system in place, it may not be defensible in the court of law. We can do seniority-based downsizing, which is a last-in, first-out method. So the least senior are the first to go in layoffs. Now remember, when there is a bona fide seniority system, that's when you can do a seniority-based downsizing. And the seniority-based downsizings will trump any diversity or affirmative action efforts that we make. So we cannot turn around and say, well, even though we have a bona fide seniority system, we want to retain all our diverse workers and get rid of our majority workers. You cannot do that when there's a bona fide seniority system in place. So when we have seniority, seniority always rules, whether it's seniority in terms of who gets promotions or whether it's reverse seniority, least seniority gets laid off. Always, always, always we follow the rules of the seniority-based system. We could do a salary-based downsizing, where we might get rid of the most highly paid workers. That's not as common and is certainly not as popular with employees, but you can understand why an organization does that with respect to making economic decisions, getting rid of the most higher paid workers and bringing in new workers at a lower level and a lower level salary. What are the downsides of doing that? Well, clearly, if you're getting rid of your highest paid workers, you're also getting rid of the most institutional knowledge, the most information about the company, the most successful employees, and the most experienced. So if you're getting rid of those higher paid people, yes, you're getting rid of a high paying salary, but you're also losing a ton of knowledge as that person walks out the door. So there's a tremendous downside to only making a decision based on economics. Whenever we make a decision purely based on economics, I can guarantee you it is going to hurt you more times than not, because if you're only doing it based on the numbers and not doing it based on strategy, the market will understand and see that, and they're going to punish you. And I mean, by the market, I mean the stock market. The stock market understands if you're not making a decision based on a good strategy, the stock market responds accordingly. We can also do competency-based downsizing and look at people who don't have the competencies that we want to retain. And this becomes particularly relevant when we are redesigning our business from the ground up, where we only look at the key competencies that are the most important and we keep those. Lastly, there might be self-selection downsizing, where we might offer people buyouts or early retirement packages, and then people can choose whether or not they want to accept that. Sometimes companies go to the self-selection downsizing first, where they make targeted offers to people to have them leave. But again, you have to be careful of some of the legalities around that. And just as we would with the salary-based downsizing, some of our concern might be with the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, where we might be targeting our older workers and not getting rid of people who might be poor performers. So if we're targeting our older workers, that may be considered a form of age discrimination, and we want to be incredibly careful about how we manage that, how we word it, and how we follow through on things. If the company is making a decision to downsize, we need to ensure that we are doing it effectively and efficiently, of course. Planning is important. Having a really clear plan, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're going to do it is essential. Having a strategy behind it, having a new way of thinking about the strategic vision of the company is also going to be important. The stock market understands and responds negatively to layoffs that are done simply for the purpose of making the books look better than what they really are. So what are some unintended outcomes of doing downsizing? What are some things that we could expect to see so that you are prepared and that you can provide to your HR department and to your senior people? These are the side effects that we can expect from doing a downsizing. Number one, you're going to get more costs. Everybody thinks that a downsizing means less cost, but in fact it means more, because you have to pay for severance. You've got to pay for training for new people who are going to now be doing different jobs or expanding their jobs, and so they have to be able to know how to do more with less. You may have to pay for consultants to come in and help you to decide what is the best route for doing downsizing. You're going to get reduced shareholder value. You're basically going to end up in a situation where you think you're doing this because it's going to be better financially, but because it's going to have more costs, your expenses will go up, and your shareholder value will start to go down. You're going to get less efficiency because, again, you're going to be losing experienced people. And this becomes particularly salient when you're doing a salary-based layoff, or you're doing a layoff based on buyouts or early retirements or things like that, because the people who have the most options will take those buyouts very quickly and they'll run elsewhere and get another job. So they will take the money and then they will go to other places. But what they're also taking with them is experience and expertise. You'll see decreased morale and motivation. People start to have issues with survivor guilt. How come I still have my job but my friend no longer has a job? They bought a house, they're in bad financial straits, I feel guilty, I don't even want to call them because I feel so sad. Those kinds of things happen. I mean, we don't downplay it. Those kinds of guilt associations are really challenging for people. You're going to get increased absenteeism and turnover because your desirable employees will feel very stressed. So we'll start to see people not coming to work. They'll be psychologically checked out. They might be surfing the web during their breaks trying to find jobs, or they might jump ship sooner than later because they don't want to be around a company with that much chaos. You're going to get lower trust. You're going to get a reputation for a company that does layoffs. As much as sometimes they're absolutely necessary, in the market, people don't want to go work for a company that is, their first reaction is lay them off, lay off employees. People want to work for a company that cares about investing in them, and layoffs don't signal investment in employees. When a company's employees take advantage of unemployment insurance, their future premium rates go up. So yes, you can do unemployment insurance, and yes, you can offer unemployment insurance to those that you lay off, but that's going to cost you more money too. And then try to attract top talent after a downsizing. It's going to be very hard because your reputation has been sullied. So now you're going to have to pay more money to attract people to come and do jobs. Or if you lost a lot of that intellectual property from people who took early retirement and stuff like that, you may have to pay them money to come back and consult for you so that you don't lose that expertise. And consulting costs you way more money. So recognize that downsizing should not be your first option. It should be your last option, that it is an option of last resort, that it is traumatic to people emotionally, financially, you name it. And we have to make sure we've got a really good solid plan that justifies downsizing as an option, because it's about how we're reorganizing what we do, reorganizing the way we think about our work and our workflows, and this is the most important, this is the best way for us to go about doing that. If you're doing it just to make your numbers look good, it's going to come back to bite you in the end. As I said in the previous slide, survivor syndrome is a real thing, that people start to feel emotionally upset about the fact that they actually survived a layoff. They worry about whether or not they're going to be the next on the chopping block. There's a lot of uncertainty there. They feel anger because the company is violating a trusting relationship with them. There's a lot of anxiety. There's concern about whether the organization is even going to be viable in the near term future. And what survivors are largely preoccupied about, aside from the guilt of being the survivor, where their neighbor or their coworkers are no longer are employed there, they start to worry about whether or not they're going to have a job themselves. So they are thinking about, how do I get a new job? How do I keep the food on the table for my family? How do I make things work? So there's a lot of adverse effects. It creates enormous amounts of anxiety and stress for people, which we know decreases people's health, decreases their performance on the job. All of these things can be really challenging. So what we want to try to do the best we can is to manage that survivor's guilt. And we can manage survivor's guilt when we can demonstrate to people that we have a clear plan in place for what we're doing and why we're doing it, and that it makes sense. You may even want to vet the plan in advance with key employees that you trust and have them become advocates for you amongst the rank and file employees. So people that can really help you to rethink the way that you do things. Whenever you're making any kind of major changes, don't always assume those changes should come from the top. Oftentimes, your people who are at the rank and file, who are doing the work every day, can come up with really good, effective, and efficient ways to get work done that top management can't see, because the people who do it every day are the ones that are the most close to the issues and are able to make those kinds of decisions themselves. It's very common to offer assistance to your displaced employees, which means that you will help them find another job. You might do job retraining. You might connect with an outsourcing firm to help them build new resumes and help them with searches for new jobs. And this becomes an important thing if you know you're doing a sizable layoff, right? So you contract with that outsourcing firm, and they help people with career planning. So they may decide they don't want to stay in the career path they were on. And this is a great opportunity as they begin a new company in a new direction, that they can do something different with their careers. So the outsourcing firm has people who are career development experts that will help people make some transitions. They help them reframe their resume. They help them with identifying search firms or job opportunities that are available for them. So these are really helpful for people because they can also connect with job fairs, and they have connections with other employers to get jobs for people. So depending on when the skill level is, they can do that. So all of those things are really important, and any and all of that you can offer to your new employees would be beneficial. So the last thing you want is to say, hey, we're going to lay you off and I'm not going to help you do anything. Here's your 2-week severance and I'll see you later. It's a better situation to say, I know we have to do this layoff. I know this is very hard, and here's what I'm going to do to help you. I'll help you with some career retraining. I'll help you with rebuilding your resume. I'll make sure that we pay for a headhunter for you to go and look for a new job, whatever it takes. So there's lots of things that we can do to help people, particularly people who we know are skilled, and we hate to lose them, but they just don't have a place in the new organization structure. So there are 7 typical downsizing activities. Some of the things that we do, and these are not necessarily in any particular order, but these are some typical things that we have to do if we're going to do a downsizing. Number 1, we do a workforce demographics review, including retirement and other loss projections. We want to make sure we assess age, diversity, and skills in the workforce, because if we are going to be decimating our company by doing a layoff and diversity, we need to be able to defend that in the courts in case anybody comes back and sues us and says, your layoff is having an adverse impact against diverse hires. Again, we've got to make sure it's defensible. We want to do an assessment of available buyout options to avoid involuntary separations, having people leave when we don't want them to. We might do a hiring freeze. We might do buyouts, early retirement, retraining, relocation, any of those things. And the goal here is we don't want people jumping ship. So anything that we can do to retain people in advance of a downsizing is important. So asking them to have, agreeing to stay on for an extra bonus or a different kind of severance pay would be really helpful. We want to make sure we understand all of our full-time employee reductions and make sure we understand the year they came on board, where do they work, what program they're in, occupation, position, and person. And we want this level of detail because, again, we want to be careful that we don't see patterns of discrimination that are occurring in our data. So keeping track of these people, why they're being let go, how well they performed, all those variables, making sure we include all that. We want to conduct our downsizing or reduction in force after we've identified who we're letting go. We want to make sure we help with career transition and job placement when we can. We want to also make sure we are helping those who survived the downsizing. You don't want to turn around and go, "Hey, congratulations, you're keeping your job. Good luck, and I'll see you, in another month or in another week." We need to help these people rethink the way they do work. We may need to retrain them. We may need to rethink how the work is flowing through the company. And so we have to be prepared to spend money to help people deal with these changes in their job and also deal with the psychological impact that it's going to have when they're now having to work twice as hard than they did before, doing work differently, and also the guilt they feel from being a survivor. Lastly, we want to make sure that there's retraining in place. And again, that ties in with the survivors of downsizing to make sure we deal with the psychological but also the work-related issues. The difference between a layoff and a downsizing is that even though we use the term "I got laid off" when we've been downsized, there's no chance of you being rehired by the company in the near-term future. It's certainly possible maybe in a few years if the company is reorganizing and regrowing and they might want to look at where their people landed and they might want to bring you back. That's always possible, but that's not the expectation when there's a downsizing. When there's a downsizing, the expectation is the company is making those jobs disappear and they're not coming back ever, or at least not in the short term. A layoff is a temporary end, and usually it's done for short periods of time. Sometimes when it comes to seasonal cyclicality in business, like if there's more demand during the summer for construction, but then there's a layoff during the winter months so that people can collect unemployment while they are during the cold weather and they can't do construction in the same way. So employers don't like to do layoffs, mostly because there are laws about how to handle layoffs and the expectations regarding collective bargaining and seniority and those sorts of things. So a layoff is really different, even from a legal perspective, that we need to be aware of. So oftentimes, if we're going to do a seniority-based layoff, we may be in a situation where we're losing some of the key competencies that we want. But if we have a collective bargaining agreement, we don't have a choice. We have to utilize seniority to be able to make those decisions. It's really important that we recognize that. And so our layoffs can create real problems with respect to how we can meet our strategic objectives. Layoffs also increase health problems and withdrawal behaviors because people don't like the uncertainty of cyclical workloads where they're on and working for a while, then they're not working for a while, etc. They also have a negative impact on diversity, since women and minorities tend to be the last hired because companies, become more diverse over time. But when they do seniority-based layoffs, you lose a lot of your diversity. But again, remember, a bona fide seniority system under the law has to be adhered to, even if it destroys or has a negative impact on diversity and affirmative action efforts. With layoffs, career transition advice can be provided to people. Usually there's some sort of training assistance or severance pay or things like that. But layoffs can certainly still have a negative impact on people. The difference, though, as I said, between a layoff and a downsizing is that a layoff can be temporary. Workers can be recalled. And so sometimes when companies are having some financial difficulties, they will close a plant down, like Granite City Steel. They closed the plant down for a while. They did minimum work, and now as the economy picks up a little bit, they can bring workers back, and now people will go back and work for Granite City Steel, and they will come back to their jobs. But again, if cyclicality happens, they lose their job. The same thing happens again in the future where they might lose their job again because of a layoff. If we can avoid layoffs, we should try to do that. So some of the things you should consider first is looking at attrition and seeing if attrition is a better alternative than doing a layoff. You can do a hiring freeze where, if nothing else, you don't bring in new employees or you don't replace people. You can do early retirement incentives. You can do buyout incentives. You can do leaves without pay, so people would be off and they wouldn't get any money. Now, there's some challenges to that, but the upside is everybody takes leave without pay. There's nobody that is exempt from that. So that sort of spreads the hurt to everybody in some ways, which can be helpful. Flexible work arrangements, again, where we might have shorter hours per day so that we can get our work done and then have people sort of staggered over the day. We could do redeployments where we could send people to different locations. So even if I don't need somebody here, I might need them elsewhere, so I redeploy them to a new location. We could do cross-training and retraining to help people to move from different positions if I know I'm going to have a surplus in one area but a deficit in another area. So I can retrain people and move them. Very similar to redeployment, and often with redeployment, we can cross-train and retrain, right? We could do reduced work hours or reduced pay. Again, unions tend to like the reduction that it comes across the board and hurts everybody the same, as opposed to some people losing their jobs and some people keeping their jobs. You can do sharing company ownership with workers in exchange for lower pay. So you might say you get to be the owner even though you don't get a lot more money. And so people will feel like they have some ownership and some voice in what's going on. And when the company is more profitable, their stock value goes up, as well as their salaries, of course, should go up over time. We can also use more temporary or contract workers on a temporary basis. So we might bring in a temp who's going to come work for us for a limited amount of time, and we don't have to worry about paying them extra benefits. We simply pay for them. We pay a fee to use them in our company. So that would be a cheaper way than hiring people on. So if we're not sure about the demand for our workforce, I would go with using temps first before we would make a commitment to a full-time employee. There are some best practices when we're going to do downsizing and layoffs. First of all, senior leadership has to play an important role in this, which means that they need to have a good strategic direction and they need to be communicating what that strategic direction is. We need to make sure that we've got two-way communication from the lower levels going up and the upper levels going down. HR has to facilitate that. We want to make sure we've got the right people involved in a downsizing plan. So particularly if we're going to be reorganizing the way that we do our work, we want to get key players in there who understand workflows and what would be the right way to do things. If you give your employees a challenge and ask them to come up with a plan that can save the business and to help them to be more effective, they will come up with plans for you. There's plenty of evidence out there that these sorts of things occur. So it is important that we make sure that we get the right people involved in the planning process. We want to be thinking about, in that process then, what will not be needed in the future. So we need to be forward thinking. We need to have a vision for where we see trends and where we see things that may or may not be going on. We want to look at incentives to offer to people before we go to the layoff. So if we can reduce our workforce by early retirements and buyouts, people like that, and oftentimes people are willing to take a buyout because they may have some other job opportunities available to them anyway. Try to think about multiple strategies and techniques to get your goals done, and so that you can maximize your outcomes. That's your goal. So use a lot of different strategies. Don't assume that one way is going to fix your problems. We need to do some strategic planning. We need to do workflow analysis. We need to look at different work processes. We need to do a utilization analysis for all of our plants and all of our locations to see if we're maximizing the use of our resources, and if not, do we get rid of our excess? Or do we try to maximize use of our space and time with new innovations? We want to make sure that if we're going to do a layoff, that we make sure we give transition assistance to people. It's painful, so it's really important that we do that. We want to monitor progress and make sure that what we're doing is effective and it's not going to hurt our bread and butter. We're not losing some important core people that are going to hurt us in being able to survive a layoff. Downsizing depends on the survivor's trust, fairness, and perceptions and belief in the firm. So every step of the way, everything we do should be focused on how do we keep people's trust, how do we make sure that people feel like the system is fair, and how do we keep them excited about the future of the firm. We can evaluate that we were effective by looking at a number of different things. Obviously, looking at our full-time employee headcount goals. Do we have enough full-time employees to be able to do the work of the company? And if we don't, then we've made a mistake. We want to make sure that we are looking at the ratio of supervisors to employees to make sure there's enough coverage and that the supervisors are going to be capable of managing a larger number of employees. We want to make sure that we look at the employees lost due to attrition versus an incentive program. So to be able to differentiate between those. And so what we don't want is people leaving on their own and that are the talented ones that we want to keep. But it also is helpful for us to have people leave the company and then we cannot replace them. That also can be a better cost savings for us as long as it's not our high potential employees. We want to look at the demographics of the buyout recipients to make sure we're not losing all of our high talented individuals and our high potential employees, and we're not losing all of our diversity too. We want to make sure that we can still work, we have a budget that's workable, right? So if we're going to have some increased costs up front, but the expectation is over the long haul, we'll be saving money to offset that. So we want to make sure we can do that. We want to look at the productivity changes to see what we need to do to help our workers to maintain productive. That might mean more training interventions or teaching them how to work more efficiently. We want to look at the reduction in the total costs of salaries and wages. That is a great way of assessing our downsizing because that becomes the primary reason many times, what we're trying to do is decrease our costs. And to do it in a way that is strategically directed, right? But still, the goal is to reduce costs, and that's a big place where we can reduce costs. We want to make sure that we had a good layoff that didn't create lawsuits for us. So we want to look at grievances and appeals and lawsuits to make sure that those are at a minimum. We want to look also at the number of voluntary participants in incentive and career transition programs versus those that we had to push out the door, whether they wanted to go or not. And so if our goal is to see what we could do with the voluntary programs by the incentives and buyouts, look at that first. And if that number is adequate, then we don't need to go with a whole company-wide layoff. But if it looks like it's not working, then we may have to turn to a company-wide layoff to make things work.